The name Charles Manson is forever linked with 8 brutal murders committed in Los Angeles in July and August 1969. Indelibly seared upon the public consciousness is Manson's image as a cult leader madman who programmed his unwitting followers to kill. Though he died in 2017, the myth of Manson persists. At 7 million copies, Vincent Bugliosi's Helter Skelter is still the best-selling crime book of all time, feeding the legend of Charles Manson, a media-enhanced byword for absolute, incarnate evil. Yet the condemned and convicted Manson, an eccentric outsider, just months before the 1969 murders, moved within prominent social circles. He befriended Dennis Wilson, a founding member of the most successful American rock group of the 1960s. Wilson considered Manson a guru-like figure and used Manson's song lyrics on the Beach Boys' February 1969 album, 2020. The Tate LaBianca slayings, also known as the Manson family murders, have been endlessly rehashed in articles, books, and movies, often in grisly detail. Our goal, rather than simply recounting the helter-skelter mythology, is to relate the story behind the story, the origins of Charles Manson. Celebrity victims Sharon Tate, the actress wife of famed director Roman Polanski, their friend Jay Sebring, and Manson's sensational LA trial give the story an unmistakably Hollywood and California backdrop. Far less known, however, is that lifelong criminal Charles Manson began his law-breaking career as a boy delinquent in the faraway state of Indiana, and there gained entree into the mass media maelstrom. In this presentation, we will uncover the young Manson. We'll detail his exploits in the Hoosier State, along the way exploring connections to other events and figures in true crime. We'll rely heavily on primary source documents in the Indiana State Archive, allowing original correspondence to bring us closer to the story as it happened. Charles Manson was born in 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio, to 16-year-old Kathleen Maddox. She had run away from home and become pregnant by Colonel Scott, his actual name, not a military rank. Scott left Maddox well before the birth of Charles. She married William Manson prior to Charles' birth. Court records state this was to avoid stigmatizing Charles as illegitimate. The marriage was a short one. Documents state that William Manson died when Charles was young, and that he had no memory of his stepfather. Kathleen Maddox Manson served time in prison for robbery at West Virginia's now decommissioned Mooresville State Penitentiary. Closed in 1995, it has a unique Gothic design modeled after the prison in Joliet, Illinois. Its webpage invites the public to visit for paranormal investigation tours and ghost hunting. A summary record describes Manson's mother in the following terms. Quote, marital history, several marriages and common law relationship. Drank to excess. Conflicts with her family, with Charles, with her husbands, and had financial difficulties. Attitude towards child, cold, rejecting, and disinterested. In his mother's absences, Charles would live in West Virginia with his maternal grandmother and later his aunt and uncle. Tuberculosis in the family required Charles to move to a foster home to avoid being infected. His foster father died and Charles was returned to his mother. The instability of his early life supports Manson's claim in interviews decades later that he never had a family. In 1947, Kathleen Maddox left West Virginia with a traveling salesman and moved to Indianapolis. She later arranged for Charles to join her. Thus began Charles Manson's tumultuous years in the state of Indiana. A court document describes Manson's early days in the state. Quote, after coming to Indianapolis, Charles received little attention from his mother and the many men who are reputed to have lived with her. To her credit, Kathleen Maddox Manson tried to find a foster home for Charles, but without success. Instead, she enrolled him at the Gibault Home for Boys in Terra, Haute, Indiana, his first recorded institutionalization in what would soon become a long list of boys' homes, reform schools, and prisons. Terre Haute, French for high land, is a small city about 70 miles southwest of Indianapolis. In the sphere of true crime and offenders, it was here that decorated Iraq War veteran Timothy McVeigh was incarcerated and eventually executed for his role in the Oklahoma City bombing. His death by lethal injection occurred in that extraordinary year of 2001, on June 11th, exactly 3 months prior to the September 11th attacks. Returning to the Manson story, his mother enrolled him at the Gibault Home for Boys, an institution run by the Catholic Church. It is now known as Gibault Children's Services. This institution is plainly visible from the city's main thoroughfare at the south end of town. Gibault was not run as a reform school. However, Manson's biographer states that, quote, "The answer to any infraction of the rules was a leather strap or wood paddle and lost privileges," unquote. Manson ran away from Gibault and went to his mother's home in Indianapolis. She brought him back. After 10 months, his mother could no longer pay the tuition. Charles was taken out of the school and went back to live with his mother in Indianapolis. Now the real trouble began. After an argument, his mother told him to take his clothes and leave. Charles rented a room in the downtown district of Indianapolis. For a time, he supported himself working as a messenger boy for Western Union, as many other boys had done throughout the decades. But he eventually fell into criminal activity. Young Manson and another boy, aged 12, entered a downtown grocery store and stole $9, splitting the money between them. He later committed automobile theft. After stealing a bicycle, he was caught by the police. While explaining the difficulties of his home life, Manson found a sympathetic listener in juvenile court judge Joseph Hoffman. This dead-end kid had been granted admission to the famous Boys Town near Omaha, Nebraska. With this surprisingly heartwarming article and photo, 14-year-old Charles Manson entered the public consciousness. This refuge for homeless and abandoned boys got a boost from the highly grossing 1938 MGM film of the same name. Mickey Rooney, a pool shark hoodlum, turns his life around with the help of benevolent Father Flanagan, played by Spencer Tracy. Unfortunately, Charles Manson's stay at Boys Town lasted only 4 days and did not have the intended effect. He and another boy took off, heading eastward. Along the way, they stole a motor scooter, then abandoned it. Later, they stole a car, which they wrecked. In Peoria, Illinois, they stole $2,000 from a grocery and spent part of it over the next 2 or 3 days. The pair also held up the Candlelight Gambling Resort with guns, pocketing another $1,900. They were caught in Peoria, and Charles Manson was brought back to Indianapolis to appear before the same juvenile court that had given him another chance. Boys Town policy was not to take back boys who had run away. Manson was back in the Marion County Juvenile Center near 25th and Keystone, but bragged to a staff member, "I won't stay very long at this place." Charles Manson, the budding escape artist, staged another dramatic exit, making front-page news. One paper called it movie-like. The Indianapolis Star said it was one of the largest mass escapes ever made from the center. Without naming Manson, both newspapers cited the recent Boys Town runaway as the ringleader. Manson and 7 other boys, feigning sleep, waited until a supervisor made a 4 a.m. bed check. Then they tied blankets together to make a rope ladder and used it to climb down to the ground from a second-story bathroom window. Manson later said the idea came from a movie. The juvenile campus was built in 1990, but it appears to have an older mid-20th century wing. Old news articles indicate that the building Manson stayed in was opened in 1944. The building pictured may have been where Manson stayed and later staged his escape. Police caught Manson a few hours later at 2258 North Meridian after receiving a report that 4 boys were attempting to steal a car. The apartment building at this address was built in 1925 and likely appeared much the same in young Manson's day. In view of Charles' front-page escapes and his other criminal acts, juvenile court judge Hoffman signed the order committing the 14-year-old to the Indiana Boys School in Plainfield, a true reform school. Built in 1867, the Plainfield institution operated as the Indiana Boys School, which we'll shorten to IBS, for over 130 years. After 2005, the site became a home for adult offenders. Archival records show that Manson's vocational assignments in Plainfield included the bakery, farming, the machine shop, shoe repair, and auto mechanics. Also in the file are requests to transfer to new vocations and dormitories, receipts, clothing reports, progress evaluations, and items of personal history. A letter from the head of the school says that Charles Manson ran away from the IBS 6 times. Another record lists the dates of the escapes. Quoted in a news article, a boys' school official explained that, since they were not running a prison with fences and high walls, occasional escapes were to be expected, as this quaint 1917 wanted poster suggests. The records also show that Charles Manson was temporarily removed from the IBS and placed with his aunt and uncle in West Virginia. Charles had apparently improved his conduct, and a return to his family in West Virginia was a reward for good performance. 3 weeks after arriving in McMeechin, West Virginia, Charles left his aunt and uncle's home, stealing from them a pistol and $90 cash. He hitchhiked to Wheeling, West Virginia, and sold the gun for between $9 and $10. He bought a knife and a transit ticket to Indianapolis. He was recaptured in Noblesville, Indiana, about 20 miles northwest of Indianapolis, and held there briefly in the Hamilton County Jail before being returned to the IBS in Plainfield. The old Hamilton County Jail is notable for another famous inmate. David Curtis Stephenson was held there during his heavily publicized 1925 trial for murder. Steve had been the Grand Dragon and head of the Indiana Ku Klux Klan during the peak of its power in the 1920s. It had a membership of 250,000 that included the governor and half the state legislature. The 1920s Klan also published a high-circulation weekly newspaper in Indianapolis called The Fiery Cross. A July 4, 1923 conclave in Kokomo, north of Indianapolis, drew a crowd of 100,000. Stevenson and his bodyguard held his love interest Madge Oberholzer captive during a trip from Indianapolis to Hammond, near Chicago. During the trip, she swallowed mercury tablets to commit suicide, but instead died weeks later after an agonizing ordeal. Her dying declaration was used to convict Stephenson of murder, bringing a cataclysmic end to the Indiana Klan's 1920s prominence. Like Manson, during his sensational trial half a century later, Stephenson vociferously asserted his innocence, and obscure documents in the Indiana State Library provide evidence to support this claim. These events and the subsequent trial were dramatized in a 1989 movie, Cross of Fire, starring Lloyd Bridges and John Hurd, who is pictured speaking at a 9/11 Truth event. In an interesting synchronicity, Charles Manson's commitment to the IBS happened the same year that Hollywood came to Plainfield. The 1949 United Artists film Johnny Holiday was filmed at the boys' school and featured Indiana-born entertainer Haute Carmichael as himself. In the titular role, Alan Martin Jr. plays a troubled kid facing reform school in Indiana and a moral crisis. Inmates and staff at the IBS played themselves in the movie. A world premiere of the film at an Indianapolis theater brought Hollywood luminaries Bob Hope and Jane Russell to town. In another escape, Charles Manson and 6 other boys ran away, stole a car, and headed to nearby Indianapolis. Police found Manson, the driver, hiding under the car he stole, after they got reports of a burglary at a gas station near Davidson and Michigan streets. The Indianapolis News pictured Manson next to their front page article. He was also mentioned on the front page of the Indianapolis Times. This location today appears to be a construction zone for a new highway. After his arrest, Manson said he stole the car in or near Mooresville. A mere 8 miles from Plainfield, Mooresville, Indiana was the home of the notorious 1930s gangster John Dillinger. Dillinger, like Manson in his time, enjoyed a significant level of public support despite the brutality of his crimes. Some folks, hit hard by the Great Depression, viewed Dillinger as a hero on a righteous crusade against a corrupt system. Manson and Dillinger both excelled at escaping. The Dillinger gang was contemporary with the Ma Barker gang, also known as the Barker-Karpus gang. Both outfits terrorized the public psyche in the 1930s. The only survivor of the Barker gang was Alvin Creepy Karpus, whose crime spree ended when he was personally arrested by J. Edgar Hoover. Sentenced to Terminal Island Federal Prison off the coast of Los Angeles, he taught fellow inmate Charles Manson to play the guitar. Charles Manson resumed his stay at the Indiana Boys' School, but his time in the Hoosier State was nearing an end. In yet another act of defiance, he and 2 other boys got away from the boys' school by stealing the staff physician's car. By stealing cars and then driving them until they ran out of gas, they eventually reached Utah. A confident Charles Manson mailed a postcard from Utah to his friends at the Plainfield Boys' School. Exhibiting a dark sense of irony, the runaway exhorted his mates to behave themselves. Another postcard from Manson said he was going 80 over the Rockies. The law caught up to Manson et al. In Utah. Driving a stolen car across state lines is a violation of the Dyer Act. Manson had now broken federal law. His Indiana chapter ends with his placement in the National Training School in Washington, D.C. Researchers, professional and amateur alike, will find in the Indiana Archive many opportunities to study the developing mind of young Manson. To cite just one example, a message to the director reads, "I want to talk to you because I think I am going crazy." Under the heading Probable Causes of Delinquency is the suggestion that, quote, Charles had no emotional anchorage and had learned from past experience that he could put little confidence in adults. The record is not all bad, however, and includes such complimentary judgments as, he presents a very foregoing appearance, is cheerful and affable. Signs of progress, though, were typically followed by escape or other acts of defiance, such as eating peaches. One child welfare letter expresses dismay at Manson's bitter resentment toward anyone who tries to help him. Though many of his grades were poor and he required special help in reading, his mechanical aptitude was superior and rated at 100 percentile. This skill set may have aided his operation of an auto theft ring in later decades, and his altering of Volkswagen Beetles into desert dune buggies. A summary record states, Charles has average intelligence, but psychopathic signs predominate in the test patterning. One IBS document lamented that Manson represented one of the most severe custodial problems this institution has ever had, while conceding that he showed an unusual degree of leadership ability and influence on others. These eerie analytical statements and the escape stories from the archive prove that Manson's flair for convincing others to join him in defying authority began at an astonishingly young age. Anyone interested in learning what made Manson can turn to his short but eventful chapter in Indiana, where he first entered the limelight of media infamy, becoming a petty thief and a hardened delinquent. Young Manson showed early signs of what he would soon become, and they're all in the archive for anyone to read. The documents tell the story, and the myth of Charles Manson endures.